If your sperm stays in your body for too long, it deteriorates. For various reasons, none of them scientific, some people believe that sexual abstinence gives them health benefits. Very recent, high-quality evidence completely contradicts this claim. I am Dr. Borja Bandera, a physician specializing in endocrinology and nutrition. Today you'll learn why frequent ejaculation benefits you more than it harms. First, until now, most fertility clinics recommended maintaining between 5 and 7 days of abstinence before ejaculation, which would be used to assess semen quality. That is, before doing a semen analysis. A similar period of abstinence was also recommended before providing semen for an in vitro fertilization process, which, as you know, is becoming more and more common. These guidelines, however, were designed to obtain the highest sperm count, not to prioritize the best sperm quality. In other words, quantity was always prioritized over quality, but new evidence contradicts these recommendations. It's a meta-analysis that combines 115 studies in humans, involving almost 55,000 men, and also 56 studies that evaluate the impact of sperm storage in 30 animal species. A rather unusual and quite comprehensive study. The results are very interesting. The longer the participants went without ejaculating, the more DNA damage, oxidative stress, and inability to swim the sperm showed. This is due to a phenomenon called post-meiotic senescence. Sperm cells have a big and complex mission, but they're actually very vulnerable to oxidative stress. They have no ability to repair DNA, limited energy resources, and their membrane and mitochondria are easily damaged. It's no surprise then that the longer they're stored, the more damage they suffer and their quality gets worse. They're not designed to survive for a long time. They're the Usain Bolt of nature. They're made to sprint and fulfill their mission in the shortest possible time. Eggs, on the other hand, work differently. They're much more resilient, and of course this translates into a clinical result. The less frequent the ejaculation, the worse the reproductive results. This is something that, on the other hand, was already confirmed by this clinical study published at the end of last year, where they divided the participants into two groups. One group had an abstinence period of less than 48 hours, and the other followed the World Health Organization recommendations, which still promote abstinence between 2 and 7 days before providing the ejaculate. Well, the pregnancy rate was 46% in those who abstained for less than 2 days and only 36% in those who had a longer abstinence period. However, the authors recommend to couples who are trying for a natural pregnancy that while prolonged abstinence is not a good strategy, neither is it. An excessively high frequency in this second case may result in the sperm count not being high enough or the sperm not being sufficiently mature. The key seems to be in the balance between quantity and quality, enough sperm but also with sufficient quality. So, what ejaculation frequency is recommended? I'll tell you at the end of the video. But Borja, then abstinence doesn't work. Look, some time ago something became popular that might sound familiar. The NoFap challenges, where men were encouraged or rewarded for prolonged abstinence. Men, usually very young, would boast on social media and different forums about the longest streaks of abstinence they achieved, as if staying 30, 50, 100, 200 or 300 days without ejaculating was a trophy. On these pages, there were even emergency protocols for relapses, to the point that many young men ended up feeling guilty for ejaculating, for masturbating, or for breaking a long streak. This, of course, supposedly brought benefits for self-esteem, more testosterone, more virility, more sexual desire, more confidence when speaking or dealing with the opposite sex, more energy and athletic performance. It's just that it ended up being a placebo effect not scientifically validated. One of the very few studies that found any benefit in this regard showed that after 3 weeks of sexual abstinence, baseline testosterone levels were elevated compared to the statistical average. A bad study, poorly designed, small, and moreover, one that has never been replicated in other studies. In fact, we have evidence that contradicts this study. For example, in this other one, acute masturbation temporarily increased the levels of pregnenolone, dehydroepiandrosterone, androstenedione, testosterone, and dihydrotestosterone in plasma. What is usually confused here is the acute post-orgasm effect of demotivation, anhedonia, and calm, which is explained by the acute but temporary rise in prolactin. Prolactin is a hormone that antagonizes dopamine. If dopamine drives you to achieve, to do, to pursue, to be motivated, prolactin generates very opposite feelings. That's why after an orgasm, you don't want to do absolutely anything. And that's okay. And that's why, in a prolactinoma, the treatment is dopaminergic agonists like cabergoline, but the effect of prolactin doesn't last long and is totally reversible. In the sports context, its positive, neutral, or negative impact has also been studied. About prolactin, has anything been found? Nothing. There are 2 well-done reviews on the subject to date, and they conclude the following. Sex does not negatively affect sports performance as long as it happens at least 10 to 12 hours before the competition or physical test. Only, and I find it absurd to have to explain this, if sexual activity happens very close to physical exertion, less than 2 hours before, there may be effects on aerobic performance. I can't imagine that before a marathon, a half marathon, or any sports event, a soccer match, you would go and have sex right before going out. No, I don't think that's logical, right? Or is it? And no, sex is not an exhausting workout. Despite what people think, the energy expenditure during sexual activity is very low, between 1.8 and 2.8 metabolic equivalents. Just so you get an idea, this is equivalent to walking at a slow pace or doing light household chores. The only way sex will affect a test the next day is if it keeps you from sleeping, or you significantly reduce the number of hours you sleep, even if your sleep quality remains intact. Obviously, if you spend the whole night doing it, this will affect your performance the next day. And what about those who decide to follow voluntary abstinence for life? Among the very little evidence that has evaluated lifelong sexual abstinence in older adults, we have this study, which found mixed results. On one hand, those who abstained had a lower risk of substance use disorder. It was probably abstinence in a religious context. But they had a higher risk of obesity, metabolic disorders, avoidant personality disorder, and dependent personality disorder. That is, there is no proven and solid advantage to sexual abstinence, abstaining from masturbation, or avoiding ejaculation in any way. However, we do have evidence of just the opposite. What other advantages could frequent ejaculation have? Well, look. This 2025 meta-analysis with more than 300,000 participants showed that higher ejaculatory frequency has a protective effect against prostate cancer, and it's also significant. These findings are in line with the classic prospective study, the health professionals follow-up study, which is mentioned in the media every now and then. Let me remind you that 32,000 men, all health professionals, were evaluated over 18 years in this study. It was found that those with more than 21 ejaculations per month had a 19 to 22% lower risk of prostate cancer compared to those with 4 to 7 ejaculations per month. The results were also similar in young men aged 20 to 29, as well as in older individuals aged 40 to 49. On the other hand, ejaculating or regular sexual activity makes us happier. During the COVID-19 lockdown, lack of sexual activity was associated with a higher risk of anxiety and depression. In general, after having sex, we have better sleep quality, lower blood pressure, less stress, and more positive feelings the next morning. Moreover, we can recognize the frequency of sexual activity as a marker of longevity and cardiovascular risk. In this 10-year follow-up study, fatal cardiovascular events were more than twice as frequent in those who reported an intermediate or low frequency of sexual intercourse. The group with high orgasmic frequency had a 50% lower mortality risk compared to the group with low frequency. Although, of course, what happens here is a very clear association between poor general and cardiovascular health and erectile dysfunction, isolation, or difficulties in sexual activity. The only risk of very frequent ejaculation, from my point of view, is if it is always associated with pornography consumption. In an addictive and isolating context, which unfortunately, is the way many men ejaculate nowadays. If you want to learn about the harmful effects of pornography on men's health, I recommend watching this video. And answering the question, it's difficult to give a single definitive ejaculation frequency that works for all men. What we can conclude is that abstinence doesn't have any advantages for your health, and that daily or almost daily ejaculation seems to be protective in multiple aspects of it. Frequent ejaculation is associated with better sperm quality, lower risk of prostate cancer, better mental health, and greater cardiovascular health. Now I'm asking you directly, follower, answer honestly. No one here is going to judge you. What is your average frequency of ejaculation? See you in the next video. A big hug, and let's keep empowering.